March 14, 1944. 3:47 in the morning. The jungle around the town of San Isidro, in the province of Nueva Ecija, on the island of Luzon, was so dark it felt like the earth had swallowed the stars. Somewhere deep in the undergrowth, a man lay flat against the wet soil, his cheek pressed to the roots of a banyan tree, his breathing slow and deliberate, almost inhuman in its control. His name was Miguel Santos. He was 26 years old, a former Philippine scout, now a ghost. 40 meters ahead of him, behind a wall of corrugated iron and coiled barbed wire, sat one of the most critical Japanese supply depots in central Luzon. Fuel drums, ammunition crates, and enough rice to feed an occupying battalion for 3 months. It had to burn before sunrise, and Miguel Santos had less than 2 hours to make that happen. 22 hours earlier, the guerrilla camp was a loose collection of lean-to shelters buried beneath the jungle canopy, 8 kilometers north of San Isidro. It had no name on any map. That was the point. Miguel had returned from a 3-day scouting run the night before, his clothes stinking of river mud, and days without sleep carved beneath his eyes. He had barely swallowed a bowl of cold rice when Commander Ernesto de la Cruz called him to the map table, a flat stone with a rough charcoal drawing scratched onto a piece of salvaged canvas. "Sit down, Miguel," de la Cruz said. He was a lean man in his 40s, a former schoolteacher from Cabanatuan, whose quiet voice had a way of making every word feel final. "We received a message from the Americans last night, by radio." Miguel set his tin cup down slowly. Radio messages from the Americans were rare. When they came, they rarely brought easy news. "MacArthur's forces are moving," de la Cruz continued. "The landings in the Pacific are accelerating. Within weeks, maybe less, there will be coordinated attacks across Luzon. But the Japanese in this sector have stockpiled enough supplies at the San Isidro depot to sustain a full defensive campaign for months. Fuel, ammunition, rations." He paused, tapping the charcoal mark on the canvas that represented the depot. "If those supplies survive, the Japanese can dig in. A lot of men will die. American soldiers, our own people, everyone." Miguel stared at the map. He already knew the depot. He had sketched it from memory 3 times in the past month, noting the guard rotations, the placement of the fuel drums along the eastern wall, the narrow drainage ditch that ran under the rear fence. "The Americans asked us to destroy it," de la Cruz said. "I know," Miguel replied. "We don't have the men for a direct assault. The garrison has over 40 soldiers. There are 2 machine gun positions at the front gate. An attack would be a massacre." De la Cruz looked up. "But one man, moving quietly." Miguel nodded slowly. "One man is invisible." "There is more," de la Cruz said. He lowered his voice, as if the jungle itself might be listening. "A Japanese supply column is expected at the depot tomorrow at dawn. Trucks, fuel, additional ammunition. If those trucks arrive and the depot is still standing, the stockpile nearly doubles." He let that settle for a moment. "The operation must happen tonight, before the column arrives." Miguel looked at the canvas map. He thought about the drainage ditch. He thought about the placement of the fuel drums. He thought about a woman in the village named Lena, who had pressed a small wooden cross into his hand the last time he passed through, saying nothing, just holding his eyes for a moment, the way people do when they are not sure they will see you again. He pushed the thought away. "Tell me the guard schedule," he said. For the next 2 hours, de la Cruz went through every piece of intelligence the network had gathered: the shift changes, the sentry positions, the location of the officer's billet on the north side of the compound. 3 guards rotated along the perimeter every 90 minutes. The eastern wall was the quietest, backing against an overgrown rice paddy that the Japanese considered impassable after dark because of the drainage channels. They were wrong about that. By noon, Miguel had his plan. It was not elegant. It did not have a great margin for error. But it was the kind of plan that a man who had spent 2 years living between the trees and the shadows could execute alone. He spent the afternoon resting in short intervals, eating everything he could keep down, checking his equipment with the focused ritual of someone going through a kind of prayer. A coil of thin wire, 3 ceramic pots of lamp oil wrapped in cloth, a box of matches kept dry inside a doubled rubber pouch, a short-bladed bolo knife. No rifle, too heavy, too loud, too limiting for what he needed tonight. At dusk, he blackened his face and hands with ash from a cold fire pit. At 10 o'clock, he slipped into the jungle and did not look back. He had planned to be in position by 1 in the morning. By midnight, the plan was already fraying at its edges. The drainage ditch that ran under the rear fence of the depot, the one Miguel had counted on as his entry point, was not where it was supposed to be. Or rather, it was there, but it had been partially blocked. Someone had pushed a wooden barricade across the mouth of the culvert, reinforcing it with iron stakes driven into the soft earth. It was recent work, within the last week, maybe less. Miguel lay in the flooded rice paddy, the warm water up to his chin, and studied the barricade through the darkness. His heart rate was steady, but his mind was moving fast, running through the implications. If the culvert was blocked, it meant one of two things. Either the Japanese had discovered that it existed as a vulnerability, or, and this was more likely, they had simply made a routine fortification. Either way, it changed everything. He gave himself 60 seconds. That was the rule he had invented for himself early in the war. 60 seconds to panic, to feel the cold weight of a plan collapsing, to let the fear move through him like a wave. Then it was done, and the mind had to work. He counted silently. Then he began to think. The western wall of the depot faced the main road. Impossible, too exposed, with a sentry post at the corner. The northern wall had the officers' quarters and a generator shed. Too much activity, too much light from the single electric bulb strung above the billet door. The southern wall had the main gate and its 2 machine gun positions. That left the eastern wall, but without the drainage culvert. Miguel slid backward through the paddy, moving on his elbows, until he was far enough from the fence to stand without silhouette risk. He moved south along the tree line, staying 10 meters back from the edge of the paddy, until he reached the point where the eastern and southern walls met at a corner. Here, a stand of old bamboo had grown tall enough to lean against the outer corrugated wall, its stalks brushing the iron in the wind. He measured the height with his eyes. The wall was roughly 2 meters. The bamboo stalks were nearly 3. If he could use them as a ladder, not climbing up the bamboo itself, but bracing himself between the stalk and the wall, pressing outward against both surfaces like a man walking up a chimney, he could reach the top without touching the wire. It was not part of the plan, and was barely even an idea, but it was what he had. He was moving toward the bamboo stand when he stopped dead. Voices. 2 Japanese soldiers were walking a patrol route along the outside of the eastern wall, a route that was not in any of the intelligence he had been given. They were talking in low tones, one of them coughing occasionally in the humid night air. They carried rifles, and one of them had a lantern, though it was turned down low. Miguel had 2 options. He could retreat and abandon the mission entirely, or he could wait and see whether this was a scheduled patrol or a casual one. He pressed himself flat against the base of a banana tree and did not breathe. The soldiers moved without particular urgency. Their conversation had the rhythm of boredom, not alertness. They were not searching for anything. They were simply 2 men with the misfortune of a night shift, counting the minutes until it was over. They passed the bamboo stand, turned the southern corner, and their voices faded toward the main gate. Miguel waited 5 minutes, then 5 more. The patrol did not return. He moved to the bamboo stand and began to climb. The ascent was brutal. The bamboo stalks shifted under his weight, their hollow sections creaking with a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the silence of the night. He pressed his back against the corrugated iron of the wall, feeling the rust and the ridges biting through his shirt, and used pure leg pressure to walk himself upward, centimeter by centimeter, arms braced against the stalks. His thighs burned. The wire at the top of the wall was a single coil, not the dense barricade he had expected. He had a short piece of folded cloth in his shirt pocket. He laid it over the wire, pressed down carefully to feel for the barbs, and folded his body over the top in one controlled movement. He dropped into the compound. He landed in a crouch in the deep shadow at the base of the inner wall. He held perfectly still for 30 seconds, scanning the compound. The main interior was lit by 2 widely spaced electric lights on poles. Between the pools of light, the shadows were deep and workable. The fuel drums were exactly where he had estimated, lined along the eastern interior wall in 2 rows of 12, totaling 24 drums. Beside them, stacked under a canvas canopy, were the ammunition crates, roughly 40 of them, each marked with Japanese kanji. Beside the crates was a stack of dry wooden pallets. Miguel allowed himself one small exhale of relief. Dry wood was exactly what he needed. He had brought 3 ceramic pots of lamp oil. each one sealed with a cork and wrapped in cloth against breakage. The cloth had served a second purpose during the crossing of the paddy, insulating the pots against the noise of the water. He unwrapped them now, one by one, setting them on the ground beside him. He uncorked the first one and breathed in the sharp smell of the kerosene. The plan was to create 3 ignition points, spaced far enough apart that no single response from the guards could extinguish all 3 simultaneously. The first point would be the wooden pallets beside the ammunition crates. A fire there would be fast and dramatic, drawing every available man toward the center of the compound. The second point would be the fuel drums themselves. Not the drums directly, but the dry grass and debris that had accumulated along the base of the eastern wall, beneath the drum row. Fuel drums did not need to be lit directly. Heat and proximity would do the rest. The third point would be the canvas canopy over the ammunition crates, which he would soak with the remaining oil. Once the pallets went up and the guards converged, the canvas would catch. By then, Miguel needed to be gone. The sequence mattered enormously. Light the third point first, the canvas, because it was the farthest from the shadow of the eastern wall. Then the second point, the debris under the drums. Then finally the pallets, which were the most visible and would draw the first alarm. The pallets had to go last because lighting them meant the clock truly started. He moved across the compound in stages, using the shadows between the 2 electric lights as a corridor. His footsteps made no sound on the packed earth. He had removed his sandals and was moving barefoot, feeling the ground beneath him, sensing vibration rather than trusting eyes alone. He reached the canvas canopy first. He poured oil across the lower edge of the canvas in a careful line, soaking the hem where it touched the wooden support frame. He did not pour it all. He saved enough to leave a thin trail leading away from the canopy toward the eastern wall, so the fire would appear to have originated from a different angle. He had learned from an older guerrilla named Reuben, a man who had sabotaged 3 Japanese bridges before being killed in 1943. That confusion was as powerful a weapon as fire itself. Let the enemy argue about where it started. Let them search in the wrong direction. He worked his way back along the wall to the second position, the debris line under the fuel drums. The debris was a narrow accumulation of dead leaves, rice straw, and discarded wooden fragments, the unseen detritus of a working military facility. He poured the second pot of oil along this line, letting it soak into the dry matter. Here he added a small refinement. He uncoiled the length of the thin wire he had carried and used it to hang a strip of oil-soaked cloth from the bottom rim of the nearest fuel drum, allowing the cloth to dangle just above the debris line. When the debris caught, the cloth would carry the flame upward to the drum's base. He was crouched at the base of the drum row when he heard the footsteps. A single guard was walking the interior of the compound, a patrol route that existed entirely outside anything Miguel had been briefed on. The man was moving along the northern interior wall, passing between the generator shed and the officer's billet, and he was walking in the direction of the fuel drum row. Miguel pressed himself between 2 drums and became absolutely still. The guard was close enough that Miguel could hear his breathing. He could see the cherry glow of a cigarette. The guard stopped walking. Miguel heard the sound of the man shifting his weight, tilting his head back slightly. He was looking up at the sky, perhaps checking the weather. Perhaps simply staring at nothing because it was 3 in the morning, and that is what men do on long shifts when no one is watching them. Miguel did not move. He did not breathe. He was aware of the ceramic pot in his left hand, the thin wire in his right, the matches in the rubber pouch in his shirt pocket. He was aware of all of these things, the way a man is aware of his heartbeat only when it might betray him. The guard drew on his cigarette, exhaled a long breath of smoke into the night air. Then he continued his walk, moving past the drum row without looking between the drums, continuing toward the southern end of the compound. Miguel waited until he could no longer hear the footsteps. Then he counted to 60. Then he moved to the third position, the wooden pallet stack beside the ammunition crates. He poured the last of the oil over the base of the pallet stack in a careful spiral, starting from the outside edge and working inward, ensuring that the fuel soaked into the dry timber rather than pooling on the surface where it might fail to catch evenly. He pressed a long strip of oil-soaked cloth against the base of the stack as a wick, trailing the cloth outward along the ground. He stood up, looked around the compound one final time. The interior sentry had reached the southern corner and was beginning his return walk. He had perhaps 90 seconds before the man would be close enough to see the pallid area clearly. Miguel drew the rubber pouch from his pocket and opened it with fingers that were entirely steady. He noticed that himself, the steadiness of the fingers, and was quietly grateful for it. He removed a single match. He crouched beside the cloth wick at the pallet stack. He thought about what he was about to do, not in a hesitant way. There was no hesitation in him at this moment. He thought about it the way a craftsman thinks about the last stroke of a chisel, deliberately, with full acknowledgement of what happens next and what cannot be taken back. He struck the match. The flame caught on the first strike. He touched it to the cloth wick, and the oil flared immediately, a low blue-orange flame that raced along the cloth toward the pallet base with a whisper, not a roar. In these first seconds, the fire was nearly silent. Miguel was already moving. He crossed the compound in 8 long strides, back along the shadow corridor between the electric lights. He reached the canvas canopy and struck a second match. The flame took instantly, the oil-soaked hem of the canvas catching with a soft, breathy sound that was swallowed by the darkness. He moved again, without pausing, reaching the debris line under the fuel drums in 4 more strides. He struck a third match. The debris caught with a crackle. He was running now, keeping low, moving toward the eastern wall and the bamboo stand visible above the corrugated rim. Behind him he heard the first sound of alarm. A single sharp shout, then another. The thudding footsteps of the interior sentry breaking into a run. The pallet stack had fully caught. He could feel the heat on his back even at this distance, and the orange glow was painting the compound wall ahead of him in wavering light. He reached the eastern wall at a dead run and went up the corrugated iron face the way he had come down it. But faster now, driven by something beyond technique, something older and more elemental than training. He grabbed the top of the wall, felt the wire bite his palms, even through the cloth, and vaulted over. He dropped hard into the dirt on the far side, rolling to absorb the impact, and came up, already moving. Behind the wall, the shouting had multiplied into a roar of voices. He heard the clang of a metal barrel, someone kicking over equipment in the rush. He heard boots on gravel. He heard, in the near distance, the beginning of a deep, resonant sound that was not yet an explosion, but was the precursor to one, the sound of enormous heat reaching something it should not reach. He ran through the bamboo stand and into the paddy without slowing, plunging knee-deep into the warm water, his arms pumping, his eyes fixed on the tree line 40 meters ahead. He had crossed half the paddy when the first fuel drum went. The sound was enormous, not the sharp crack of a single explosion, but a rolling, tearing concussion that pushed against his chest like a physical hand. He kept running, and the water churned white around his legs, and the second drum went, and then a third, and the sound rolled across the rice paddies and into the jungle like thunder from a storm that had arrived without warning. He reached the tree line and dove into the undergrowth. He ran for 20 minutes without stopping, putting distance between himself and the light in the sky that was visible even through the jungle canopy. When he finally slowed, his lungs were burning and his palms were slick with blood from the wire cuts. But he could feel the heat of what he had left behind radiating even from 2 kilometers away. He stopped running and allowed himself one look back through a gap in the trees. The depot was burning brilliantly against the pre-dawn sky. Not a small fire, not a manageable one. A catastrophic, total fire that sent a column of black smoke hundreds of meters into the air and turned the southern horizon into something that looked like the edge of the world. Miguel turned away from it. He had a long way to go before morning. The Japanese response was faster than he had anticipated. Within 10 minutes of the first explosion, he could hear truck engines on the main road running south of San Isidro. Not one truck, but several, moving at speed, their headlights cutting through the jungle's edge. He pressed himself behind a stand of kogon grass and watched the light sweep across the tree line, moving in the direction of the fire. They were sending reinforcements, not search parties, not yet. But the search parties would come, they always did. Miguel had planned 3 possible escape routes, each one a different direction from the depot, with designated waypoints where he could orient himself in the dark. He had planned them the way a man plans for a game of chess, not assuming any single route would be free, but building in options for adaptation. The primary route ran northeast, following a dry stream bed that cut through the jungle for 4 kilometers before emerging near the foothills of the Sierra Madre. He had walked that stream bed twice in daylight and once at night. He knew its bends. He knew where the large stones were, where the soft silt might swallow a foot. He took the primary route. The stream bed was exactly as he remembered it. A narrow channel of dry gravel and smooth river stones, flanked on both sides by root systems and overhanging ferns. He moved through it quickly, using the pale gleam of the gravel as a guide in the darkness beneath the canopy. Around him, the jungle was not quiet. The explosions at the depot had startled the birds and the insects into a brief collective silence, but now the sounds were returning. The chirp of frogs, the distant crying of something large moving through the upper canopy. He had been in the stream bed for perhaps 30 minutes when he heard the dogs. Not close, not yet, but the sound was unmistakable, the deep, purposeful baying of dogs on a scent, coming from the direction of the rice paddies. The Japanese had tracking dogs. He knew this. He had factored it into his planning, which was why he had spent an hour in the flooded paddy rather than moving overland. Water broke a scent trail, but a man trailing oil-soaked cloth and the smell of smoke and sweat was a different matter. He stopped in the stream bed and thought carefully. The dogs were south of him, at the paddies. They were working the edge of the paddy, which meant they had found where he entered the water, but not necessarily where he had exited. He had a window, maybe 20 minutes before they established the exit point, and followed his track into the jungle. He needed to cross the stream bed and move laterally. He left the stream bed at a point where a large flat stone gave him a dry step out, leaving no muddy imprint on the bank. He moved west for 300 meters through the jungle, keeping his footfalls on roots and stones wherever possible, then cut back north on higher ground where the soil was dry and firm. This was slower, and the undergrowth was thicker, tearing at his arms and face. But the higher ground also meant better drainage. The dogs would have a harder time holding a scent on the baked laterite soil of the hillside. The baying behind him shifted. It grew louder for a moment. They had found the stream bed exit point, and then the sound changed pitch, becoming more scattered, more uncertain. He had broken the clean line of the trail. He climbed. For the next 40 minutes, Miguel Santos climbed steadily through the foothills, pulling himself up by roots and rocks, his arms protesting the cuts on his palms. The jungle thinned as the elevation increased. The night was still dark. He estimated an hour before the first gray light of dawn, and the air was cooler up here, carrying the smell of pine and wet stone instead of paddy mud and smoke. Below him, the sound of the dogs faded. He did not allow himself to feel relief. Relief was a thing for later, for daylight, for a cup of hot water and a place to sit. Right now, his job was to keep moving, to keep thinking, to be the thing that was not quite there when the enemy looked. He reached a ridgeline he recognized, a long, rocky spine that ran roughly northeast, eventually descending into a valley where a network of friendly villages spread along the foothills. Dela Cruz had contacts in those villages. There were houses where a man could knock on a certain door at a certain hour and be given food and a dry mat without any questions being asked, because the people in those houses had already asked all the questions they ever needed to ask about this war and had arrived at their answers. Miguel moved along the ridge, his silhouette low against the rock, his eyes on the pale brightening that was just beginning in the east. The column of smoke from San Isidro was still visible behind him. It rose into the lightening sky like a dark finger pointing at something the earth wanted to say. He kept walking. He reached the valley just before 6 in the morning. He found the house he was looking for, a small nipa hut set back from the trail behind a stand of papaya trees, and knocked 3 times on the bamboo doorpost. After a moment, a light moved inside. An old woman named Mana Clara, who was perhaps 60, and had the expression of someone who had survived things that would have broken a younger person, opened the door and looked at him without surprise. She gestured him inside without a word. He sat on a wooden stool while she heated water over a clay pot. He pressed a folded cloth against his palms. He was shaking now, not from fear, but from the particular exhaustion that comes after a body has run entirely on adrenaline for hours and has suddenly been told that it no longer needs to. He had seen other men shake like this after operations, and had thought it was weakness. He understood now that it was simply the body catching up to the truth of what had just happened. Mana Clara handed him a cup of hot water with a piece of dried ginger root in it. She sat across from him on a low stool and looked at the smoke column visible through the open window, still rising, still thick, catching the early morning light and turning it a deep amber. "San Isidro?" she asked quietly. "Yes," Miguel said. She nodded slowly. She did not ask anything else. Miguel drank the water and thought about what had burned in that depot. 24 fuel drums, 40 ammunition crates, enough rice to feed a battalion. The supply column that was supposed to arrive at dawn would find a smoking ruin and nothing to unload. The defensive position that the Japanese garrison in this sector had spent months building around those supplies was, this morning, a calculation that no longer added up. He knew it was not the end of the war. It was not even close to the end. There would be more patrols, more garrison reinforcements, more nights in the jungle for every man and woman fighting in these hills. The war was enormous and complex, and its end was still months away, at the very best. But he also knew something that could not be taken away. Last night, one man, with 3 pots of lamp oil and a box of matches, had forced an entire Japanese battalion to recalculate its next move. One man had shifted something, not by the weight of numbers or firepower, but by patience, by silence, by refusing to accept that the odds meant the outcome. He set his cup down. Outside, a rooster crowed somewhere down the trail, indifferent to the smoke on the horizon. The jungle was waking up. Birds called back and forth across the canopy in their ancient, unhurried language. Miguel Santos closed his eyes. He let himself rest.